SpaceX's ambitions with Starship are leading the company to propose expansions and changes of operations at Starbase, which means it needs a new environmental assessment. Yes, another one. The FAA dropped a 143-page draft document that we made Alex analyse, and it really left us with a lot of questions about the changes proposed and what it might mean for mere mortals like us. What will Highway 4 even look like when almost 24,000 trucks need to go through it every year to resupply Starship's launch pad? And did you know Starship may actually be transported horizontally after landing? And that is just the tip of this gigantic iceberg. I mean, it's 143 pages. Grab your biscuits. This is going to be a long one. Let's kick things off with the most obvious question. Why does SpaceX need a new environmental assessment? In case you don't remember, back in 2021, SpaceX underwent a Programmatic Environmental Assessment, or PEA. A draft version of the PEA was published in September of that year, and essentially both the FAA and SpaceX underwent a consultation process with several different agencies to get environmental approvals for all the activities outlined in that PEA. We aren't going to talk about what that document said today. We already made a video and a live stream all the way back in 2022 digging through all the details. That process ended on the 13th of June 2022 when the FAA issued a Finding of No Significant Impact, or FONSI, that stated that after all the reviews and consultations, the activities outlined in the PEA would not significantly impact the environment. This PEA was later amended with specific studies and re-evaluations whenever SpaceX contemplated some small change that drifted from what had been studied in the PEA. For example, when SpaceX decided to add the water-cooled flame diverter underneath the OLM, the company underwent a written re-evaluation of the PEA that included the environmental effects of this system and other changes that were present for Starship's second flight. A similar thing was done when SpaceX proposed splashing Starships down in the Indian Ocean rather than the Pacific. However, this time around, SpaceX is asking for huge changes. One of them is, for example, asking the FAA to increase Starship's launch cadence to up to 25 flights per year. The launchpad outline is also changing from what was considered in the 2022 PEA, with the second launch mount and tower located in a different position and many other changes as well. Also, the new environmental assessment will consider the upcoming upgrades for Starship that are going to be debuting soon. All of these changes combined represent a big enough change that a new assessment is needed. But not everything needs to be reassessed. SpaceX says in this document that things like the amount of road closures needed, the amount of personnel, the anomaly response plans, etc. will remain the same. So this environmental assessment is only focused on the things that will actually change rather than redoing everything from scratch, and I'd say that's really good news. Now, as part of every environmental assessment, every operator needs to make the case for a potential alternative to what they're proposing. As you may know, SpaceX is also undergoing preparations for more Starship launch pads at Launch Complex 39A and Space Launch Complex 37 in Florida. SpaceX has said, though, that they don't want to rely on just those launch pads alone for a high Starship launch cadence. They make the case that if a hurricane were to go through Florida, for example, that would disable their entire capability to launch Starship. A high launch rate from Starbase would enable this similar redundancy because Texas and Florida are 1,000 miles apart. SpaceX also makes the case that both 39A and Slick 37 are far from being ready for Starship. LZ-39A needs upgrades and changes to support the updated launchpad and Starship designs. Meanwhile, Slick 37 is still under lease by ULA until the end of the year, and environmental approval is not expected until next year, so SpaceX doesn't expect any construction to take place until late 2025. This means that these potential alternatives to a higher launch cadence from Starbase had to be eliminated from the consideration. Due to the changes proposed, the FAA has identified other environmental approvals that SpaceX needs to be granted before potentially receiving a new FONSI. These approvals are under the Endangered Species Act, the Magnuson-Stevens Fishery Conservation and Management Act, and the Marine Mammal Protection Act. For that reason, the FAA has started consultations with several agencies to help on this assessment. These are the Texas Historical Commission, the Advisory Council on Historic Preservation, the National Park Service, the Texas Parks and Wildlife Department, and the US Fish and Wildlife Service. The document also says this assessment is being prepared in cooperation with the US Coast Guard and NASA. If after stating all of those laws and government departments you're still with me, well done, because now we're going to talk about the exciting stuff. We'll start with the launch pad, which is probably the one with the biggest and most obvious changes. As you all know, SpaceX is building a second launch pad at Starbase. In the documents, it is stated that the second launch pad is considered to be named Pad B, with the Integration Tower 2 and the Orbital Launch Mount 2, while the already existing launch pad is Pad A, with Integration Tower 1 and Orbital Launch Mount 1. The second launch pad part is not really new, and in fact it was already planned as a part of the 2022 PEA. Also, want to look at Starbase Live and there's a huge second tower. However, back in the day, it was supposed to be located to the south of the first launch pad, whereas now it's located to the west of the first launch pad. Back then, there were also plans to include at the launch site a bunch of other test stands, like a third suborbital stand, multiple cryogenic stations, and other locations to test development vehicles or test tanks. However, as you may already know, all of that has now moved to Massey's, which meant SpaceX was able to take over the location of the former suborbital pad for Orbital Pad B. This also enables a bunch of the changes we've already seen and that we'll soon see at the pad. For example, a single tank farm will be used for both pads instead of one tank farm per pad as originally planned in the 2022 PEA. To be able to do this, SpaceX is expanding the existing tank farm with extra tanks. We already saw SpaceX adding 9 horizontal tanks to the tank farm ahead of Starship's fourth flight. These replaced the old vertical tanks which had been removed from the Starbase skyline. Alex originally wrote in this part of the script that the vertical tanks looked really bad, and, well, I didn't really agree with that. I didn't think they were that bad, but what do you guys think? Let us know down below. As we've seen in the last couple of months, more tanks will be added, and according to this document, it seems like up to 5 sausage tanks, presumably for cryogenic fluids, will be added to the tank farm. One of them has even been installed already, and there's work already underway to place the other long tanks. An additional 4 shorter tanks will be added as well, which could be for extra methane storage or other commodities in general that might be needed at the launch site. Additionally, it appears that perhaps more subcoolers and pumps will be added on the west side of the tank farm, probably to supply Pad B's launch mount and tower. Right now, they're all bunched up on the eastern side of the tank farm and only connect to the first mount and tower. Of course, extending the tank farm means the main gate at the launch site will be blocked. This is why SpaceX has been undergoing work to open up a new gate right next to Starhopper that will replace the old one. This gate will allow SpaceX to carry vehicles from Highway 4 to either Pad A or Pad B without having anything else in the way. This tank farm extension will also need an extended berm in order to protect them from all the launches that are going to be happening from Pad A and Pad B. Additionally, trenches will be dug for all the piping needed to carry all the fluids from the tank farm all the way out to Pad B. A second launch pad also means needing a second launch mount, which, as we can see in the map, will have a larger footprint than the current orbital launch mount. You are probably already aware of this by now, but SpaceX is aiming to change the design of the mount and diverter for future launch pads. This will most likely involve a traditionally shaped flame diverter with a flame trench, or trenches, and not a flat flame diverter like the existing one at Pad A. With that in mind, it's not a surprise that the second launch mount will have a larger footprint. Despite the design change though, SpaceX will still need water for deluge, which is why a second water tank farm will be built for Pad B. This water tank farm will be larger than the first one, being able to accommodate 1.6 million litres of water versus 1.3 million litres of water in the existing tank farm. SpaceX says in this document that the extra volume will be needed in order to, quote, facilitate recycling of applied and recaptured water, provide water for cooling the launch mount deck after vehicle liftoff, and suppress sound. This essentially means that whatever new launch mount design SpaceX has in mind, this will include a way to cool off the top, unlike on the current design. This will avoid the launch mount from being cooked by the power of all the Raptors on Super Heavy every time Starship launches, which will reduce refurbishment and turnaround times. On top of that, that phrase kind of indicates that Pad B's deluge system will in fact work also as a sound suppression system. Last year we made a whole video about the current flame diverter and water deluge system at Pad A, and one thing that we emphasised is that the water was there just to cool the diverter. Essentially, its primary reason for existence was not for sound suppression, but for cooling, although, of course, some small sound suppression effect was to be expected anyways. If one takes this document's wording in the literal sense, then perhaps this new deluge system will also work as a sound suppression system. Lastly, if you look at the map all the way on the west side, it appears SpaceX wants to install an air separation unit at the launch site. If you've been around for a while, you might remember SpaceX in fact had an air separation unit already at Starbase, but within the Sanchez lot at the production site. This, however, was barely used and was eventually dismantled. With an air separation unit, SpaceX could, in theory, be able to extract nitrogen, oxygen, and argon from the air. Nitrogen is often used for cooling and purging at the tank farm, oxygen is Starship's oxidizer, and argon is often used for welding, although who knows, maybe SpaceX may use the argon as propellant for Starlink satellites. It now looks like SpaceX will be returning this kind of capability back to Starbase and has in fact proposed a similar thing for LC-39A's Starship launch pad. And as we'll see later, this may help make things a lot more environmentally friendly. So those are the many changes coming to the launch pads. But of course, there's a bunch more coming to the rocket itself. We talked about those in detail in a previous video, but there were still some questions that remained. One of those questions was something as simple as, will Super Heavy stay with 33 engines at all? In recent months, it has been becoming more clear that the most likely answer is no, and that Super Heavy may very well move to having 35 engines rather than 33. We already saw in the information pertaining to the LC-39A Starship environmental process, and now this assessment once again confirms that Super Heavy will sport 35 engines. There's a table that neatly summarises the changes in vehicle thrust, propellant mass, size, and number of engines. These numbers, however, seem to imply that the upgraded Starship and Super Heavy referenced here are probably not version 2, but rather version 3. If we look at the numbers provided by SpaceX back in April for version 2 and version 3, the numbers in this table all pretty much line up with version 3 rather than version 2. Now, this does not mean that SpaceX is somehow leapfrogging version 2 and going straight to version 3. What it actually means is that they're considering for this assessment the version with the most thrust and largest size of all of the upcoming configurations. This would in turn also cover for version 2 without any problems and would avoid them from having to perform another lengthy environmental study whenever version 3 comes around. If SpaceX can clear a massive rocket, they're also clear for a slightly smaller but also massive rocket. You know what I mean. With 2 launch pads and an upgraded rocket, SpaceX now also wants to increase the launch cadence at Starbase. As mentioned before, this will go from the current 5 orbital launches per year up to 25 orbital launches per year. SpaceX also says they're not doing suborbital flights anymore, like the ones we saw back in 2020 and 2021 with SN8, SN9, and so on. To everyone who's just scrolled down to start writing a comment saying that the current full stack flights are suborbital, you know what we mean. Since Starship is a fully reusable rocket, increasing the launch cadence to 25 launches also means increasing the landing cadence to 25 for each of the stages, up from the previous 5 landings for each stage under the 2022 PEA. Of these 25 launches, SpaceX thinks that perhaps one of them might happen during the nighttime, which is defined in the document as anywhere between 7 in the evening and 7 in the morning Central Time. I can already tell you, those Mega Mark diamonds are going to be spectacular in the dark. For me, it would also be nice to not have to wake up at 5 AM to produce a 12-hour launch livestream. As for the landings, these could happen through multiple methods and in multiple different places. Some of them were already studied in the 2022 PEA and subsequent written re-evaluations, but SpaceX has also added new locations this time around. Both vehicles could either be landed somewhere on the ocean or returned back to the launch site for a catch landing. If they were to be expended in the ocean, this could be either as a hard water landing at terminal velocity, a soft water landing, or a pre-planned breakup of the vehicles during re-entry. The document says SpaceX anticipates no more than 20 explosive events at the surface of the water for each vehicle for the life of the program, and that this would occur within the first 5 years of the program. That means they don't really intend to expend a lot of Super Heavy and Starship vehicles, but because they're going to do it at the start of the program, they still have to get that assessed. As with previous assessments, SpaceX has also considered landing either or both vehicles on drone ships at sea, but as you probably know, there's currently no hardware for that. However, including this in this assessment covers SpaceX whenever, or if ever, they do intend to carry out drone ship landings with Starship. All of the splashdowns or theoretical drone ship landings would take place in the Gulf of Mexico for Super Heavy and at 4 different locations for Starship. 2 of these we already know and have been already targeted: the Pacific Ocean near Hawaii and the Indian Ocean between Madagascar, Réunion and Mauritius and Australia. SpaceX is now adding 2 extra locations in the Pacific Ocean for its landing operations. One to the northeast, closer to the continental US west coast, and another one to the southeast, closer to South America. Based on the map provided in the document, these are most likely to be used during actual orbital missions rather than the type of missions we've seen so far. There is something else related to the landings a lot later in the document which caught our eyes during analysis. When considering the air quality effects of Starship landings in this document, SpaceX makes the case that both liquid oxygen and liquid methane are not hazardous air pollutants and that whatever remains in the tanks will be vented. And then it says, quote, "After landing and safing, the breakover fixture assembly, left bracket, controlled supported drop from vertical to horizontal, right bracket, of the Starship would commence." This is in reference to the potential air quality issues that could arise from safing and moving Starship after it has landed, which SpaceX says would have no significant impact. However, that exact phrase explaining how that safing would be carried out is the surprising news. It essentially implies that after landing, Starship will be turned from vertical to horizontal for transport, which we hadn't really heard before, and frankly it would be interesting to see what kind of hardware that would be used for such a move. Returning to how the landings will be conducted, SpaceX also explains in the document it'll keep jettisoning the hot staging ring, which they call the forward heat shield. As we already know by now, this is a temporary measure, and eventually an upgraded version of Super Heavy will have an integrated forward heat shield instead of being a separate piece of hardware added after initial assembly. That being said, SpaceX also says that, quote, "This action is anticipated to be temporary and is anticipated to take place approximately 20 times. 20 times is a lot of times to be expending a hot staging ring. Assuming a sequential numbering sequence, Booster 31 could be expending its hot staging ring. Even if this is just an approximate number and it actually ends up being 10 or 15, that's still many more times than what perhaps a lot of us were expecting. This also likely means that the upgraded Block 2 version of Super Heavy with the integrated hot staging ring might not happen for quite a while. Now, an increase in launch activity would, in theory, mean a lot more vehicle testing before they need to fly, but the document actually suggests otherwise. Despite moving Starship static fires to the Massey's test site 8 miles down the road, SpaceX still includes those in the environmental assessment, and of course, it also includes the Super Heavy tests as well, which will still be happening at the launch site. However, the total runtime for both Starship and Super Heavy static fires will go down despite the increase in launch cadence. SpaceX now expects to have a yearly total of 90 seconds of Starship static fire engine testing and 70 seconds of Super Heavy static fire engine testing, which is down from the 150 and 135 seconds in the 2022 PEA respectively. If one were to guess, this is likely because as SpaceX starts landing Super Heavy and Starship vehicles, they may introduce a similar rationale to their Falcon 9 booster reuse. These only undergo engine testing for the first flight and don't go through engine testing again unless there's been some important modification or it is needed for extra mission assurance. Now, the whole purpose of this assessment is to assess what the environmental impact of all of these activities is. Of the 143 pages in this document, we have touched only about the first 20 of them so far. The rest of the document is SpaceX going through what they think might be the impact all of this activity will have on multiple different aspects, such as marine life, the birds around the launch site, the air quality, and other environmental considerations. Of course, going into detail on all of these would likely take an entire new video, so we'll only go into the interesting stuff. Also, I don't really fancy standing here talking about boring stuff, so I won't. With an increase of launch cadence, one would expect SpaceX to need many more closures in order to test the vehicles and launch them. However, a lot of the pre-launch testing is now carried out at the Massey's outpost, which means the only stuff done at the pad is just booster engine testing, wet dress rehearsals, and of course, launches. SpaceX says that with this move to Massey's, they have seen an 85% reduction in road closures from the first flight of Starship to the third. SpaceX says it now estimates launch campaigns will only need about 20 hours of road closures per flight, which would include all the pre-launch testing, the launch itself, and post-landing operations. The company previously had a limit of up to 500 hours of road closures per year for nominal operations, which is what you would get if you multiply 20 hours by 25 launches per year. So the math checks out. It essentially means that they don't really need any extra hours of road closures, even though they're increasing the launch cadence. And that is pretty much the only thing that will remain unchanged. A lot of things will be affected due to the increased launch cadence. Think, for example, about all the truck deliveries needed for the launch site. For every launch campaign, SpaceX will need deliveries of methane and oxygen, which are the propellants used on Starship. It will need deliveries of nitrogen for the tank farm. It will probably need deliveries of other fluids like carbon dioxide and helium, and it will also need a lot of water trucks to refill the tank farm after each static fire test and launch. Starship will also grow in height, which means larger fuel tanks, which translates into needing many more deliveries per flight. In total, SpaceX estimates an additional 18,421 trucks would be needed per year. That's right, that's in addition to the current number of trucks in order to supply propellant to the launch site. The document says this is equivalent to an extra 40 trucks per day accessing the launch site via Highway 4. Now, it's not just propellant that gets delivered to the launch site. As mentioned before, water also needs to be trucked in, and SpaceX estimates another 3,800 trucks per year would be needed on top of what's currently required. Between propellant and water deliveries, SpaceX expects to need a total of nearly 24,000 truck deliveries a year, a substantial increase in road traffic from what it already experiences. While this is a huge amount of trucks, SpaceX estimates that this amount of traffic would not impact air quality and would be under the threshold of high potential for air toxics as defined by the Federal Highway Administration. SpaceX also argues that due to the changes in regulations for vehicle engines and fuels, think for example electric trucks, which their sister company might know something about, these emissions will decline over the next few decades. So overall, the company doesn't think the impact of this increased traffic would affect air toxicity or pollution. However, if like me, you've travelled down Highway 4, you'll know that the road surface is incredibly poor and it can cause serious damage to vehicles. That might be something getting on their radar pretty soon. Remember that air separation unit we talked about earlier in the video? Perhaps in the future, SpaceX could use this to at least reduce the amount of trucks that need to head out to the launch site. Sure, SpaceX makes the case that the environmental impact of these trucks might not be significant, but if not for the environment, maybe it's probably cheaper to just get the oxygen and nitrogen directly out of the air, right? On top of this, SpaceX says that due to the huge amounts of water that are going to be needed, the Brownsville Public Utilities Board is contemplating the installation of a public water line from Brownsville all the way to Boca Chica Beach. This would allow SpaceX to use this water line to refill the deluge tanks and not need any of those thousands of trucks going to the launch site. A similar thing happened in the past year with the power at Starbase, and SpaceX actually highlights this in the assessment. In the 2022 PEA, SpaceX had asked to increase the area needed for the solar farm it had near Boca Chica Village. However, since then, the Magic Valley Electric Cooperative has installed a power line that extends from Brownsville all the way to Boca Chica Beach, work that we've actually covered for the better part of 2023, and therefore the solar farm is not needed anymore. This draft document also goes into the effects of the heat plume created from the launch exhaust. Early on, it says that the estimated heat plume in the 2022 PEA turned out to be too conservative compared to the actual data from the first 4 flights. The actual heat plume extended only about under half the distance they had analysed. For example, in the 2022 PEA, SpaceX had estimated a temperature of 32.2 degrees Celsius, which is the ambient temperature in Boca Chica, at 965 meters from the launch site. In reality, this radius turned out to be only 320 meters from the pad. When making a guess as to how this will work out for a larger and more powerful rocket, SpaceX guesses that this may extend to a distance of 450 meters, and that's without accounting for the effects of the water deluge itself. That being said, SpaceX still used the same conservative models used in the 2022 PEA to analyse the heat plume effects and still expects this distance to be about the 965 meters from the launch site. With more launches comes, naturally, more deluge activations. In fact, SpaceX says that the deluge system would also be activated for about 30 seconds during super heavy landings. This was something we already guessed they would do because they rehearsed this back on Starship's 4th flight, whilst we were busy gawking at Booster 11's soft splashdown and Ship 29's smooth ascent. SpaceX argues that even with the increased usage of the deluge system, it still expects its cumulative effects would be equivalent to an additional 5.5 millimeters of rain if distributed across the impact area. When designing the water-cooled steel diverter for Pad A, SpaceX says it expected some form of ablation on the steel that makes up the plate. However, the company says that samples taken after flights 2 and 3, quote, showed negligible results for stainless steel components in all soil, air and deluge water results, and that therefore, quote, the proposed action is anticipated to continue to have negligible impacts to soil, air and water during launch operations from potential ablation. With a 5 times increase in launch cadence, one would also expect air quality to be reduced and air pollution to be increased. However, because events such as Starship and super heavy static fires have been reduced in scope, the amount of carbon monoxide and nitrous oxides released into the atmosphere over a year does not increase at a rate of 5 times, but rather closer to 3 times. According to SpaceX's estimates, these emission rates would still be under the de minimis thresholds as established by the Environmental Protection Agency. Another major impact, of course, will be the noise. SpaceX says it estimates that with the upgraded thrust of future Starship versions, the noise levels would extend further and be more intense than what was established in the 2022 PEA. However, the company also says that these noise levels would still be below the safety noise threshold established by OSHA. So if you go to South Padre Island to watch a Starship launch, it'll be a little bit louder, but it won't last long enough to affect your hearing. With increased thrust, not only will the launches be louder, but the landings will be louder as well. That being said, it is also true that Super Heavy and Starship use fewer engines for landing than for launch. So, whilst they'll be louder than what they are now, they're definitely not going to be as noisy as the launch. In fact, for landings, what will most likely startle observers won't be the engine noise, but rather the sonic booms. Who doesn't love a good sonic boom?
Here it comes. Whoa!
SpaceX also reanalyzed the impact of sonic booms given the data it had taken from the flights of Starship and based on the future upgrades that are planned. There's a bunch of different maps and diagrams detailing all of this, but we obviously aren't going to go into all of that detail. Long story short, SpaceX expects, say that 10 times fast, sonic booms from super heavy landings to extend up to 27 miles, over 43 kilometers, away from the launch site. Although, at that distance, it would be heard as a quiet thump rather than a loud boom. For Starship though, the case is a lot different. As it comes in from orbit, the extent of Starship's sonic booms would be propagated over an extended area, with the sonic booms being created in a swath rather than at a specific point. This means a lot of people in Mexico will be able to hear Starship's sonic booms, potentially for hundreds of miles, as it heads back from orbit for a landing at Starbase. Because of the re-entry profile of Starship, SpaceX says the loudest sonic boom will be experienced in the vicinity of the launch site, where it'll be attempting the landing, but that said area will always be evacuated prior to any Starship landing. If this all sounds like a lot of work and a lot of effort, that's because it is, and nobody ever said that launching the world's most powerful rocket was going to be easy. There's a lot of different regulations, rules and laws that everybody needs to follow, and at the end of the day, nobody wants to end up in front of a judge. Not SpaceX, not the FAA, and none of the cooperating agencies. In fact, there's a list of the SpaceX people that have been involved in this document and the environmental consultants that help them. These are the people that are enabling humanity to become multiplanetary while still caring for the planet we have. I've been Caton for NSF, thanks for watching, and goodbye.